welcome back to Improve with Dr. Lindsay podcast. I am Dr. Lindsay and today's episode number 4. So we're just going to be talking about the common mistakes that I see people making in the gym today. This list really could go on and on and on, but I tried to narrow it down to the more common things that I witness the most often. These are just my general observations and opinions of what I see all the time. I've worked in gyms for years. I worked in gyms before PT school, during PT school, after PT school. And we just now so happen to go to like a very big gym where there's a lot of people, and we can just say it can be hard sometimes not to people watch, especially as someone whose literal job is to analyze and critique movement. I can't help but to notice certain things. So the point of this episode is really just to kind of highlight and shed some light on common mistakes that people make in effort to help bring some knowledge and awareness and mindfulness to your own routine and hopefully help you guys be able to be safer and more effective in your own workouts. So without further ado, let's get started. And the first and probably most common mistake that I notice people making is what I call momentum-based lifting, or really just like trying to lift too quickly and with really poor control or lack of intention. So what I mean by momentum-based lifting is essentially you can think of it like cheating with the use of speed versus using the true strength of the muscle that you are trying to work on. So usually when we see something like this, it's because people are trying to lift more weight. So you're going to see other parts of the body moving or jerking in some type of way to help accomplish the movement, which is essentially what we call in the therapy world a compensation. So the simplest example of this, and probably like the most common thing that we've all seen before, is something like a bicep curl. Everybody has seen those guys who are basically swinging their entire bodies to try to get the weights up. This is a really common example. And again, it's because people are trying to focus on lifting more weight. But really at some point, we're just exchanging weight for effectiveness, in my opinion. So I can tell you from experience, if you slow down the exercise, you focus on controlling with the muscle that you're actually trying to use without using the rest of your body and without letting the rest of your body join in on the movement. Give the exercise the proper intention or mind to muscle connection, maybe even add a little hold at the top or, relax really slow and controlled. You are going to get so much more out of your workout, and you are going to make the exercise that you're doing so much more effective, more functional, probably even safer than if you were to allow your body to just use momentum and get it up there. So yes, you probably would not be able to lift even close to as heavy as you're used to lifting. So for some people who are really focused on the numbers of pounds that they can move, changing this habit is also going to take some rewiring of your mindset, reframing to focus more on effectiveness or like true strength versus the number of pounds that you are moving. And so that can be a bit of an adjustment. But I do want to be clear, when we're talking about this momentum-based lifting and how I'm saying you should lift in a slow and controlled fashion with proper intention, I'm specifically referring to like your typical strength training gym exercises that people perform when they're trying to focus on building muscle and strength. This is not a rule across the board. There are definitely reasons why someone would work on things like speed and power, but those exercises typically look a little bit different, or they have a different emphasis on the movement. So for the sake of the point that I'm trying to make right now, I am not referring to things like powerlifting or speed and agility training or sport-specific exercise. I'm really just talking about those typical gym exercises like a bicep curl. But before we move on to the next point, I do want to give you a fair warning. If you choose to implement lifting in a slow and controlled fashion in your workouts, be warned that, like we already talked about, 1, you are not likely to be able to lift or move as much weight as you are used to moving, so that can take a little bit of adjusting. 2, you're probably going to experience earlier fatigue, so you may not be able to perform as many reps or sets as you're used to performing. And 3, and more importantly, know that you're also more likely to experience what we call DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness, which is soreness that can take a day or two to come on. It also can last for longer or be more severe. This is something that it's just good to anticipate if you are changing your routine or your style, you're increasing your load, and this is something that improves as your body just adjusts to the new demands. Alrighty, so let's move on to the second most common thing that I see, and that is half reps or partial reps. And this is basically what we call it when someone doesn't go through the entire range of motion that the exercise is intended to go through. So often that could look like quick little pumping movements, or an easy common example of this would be something like a chest press, where the bar doesn't come fully to the chest and or the elbows don't fully extend at the top of the motion, so the arms don't come fully straight at the top. So what you end up seeing is guys that are kind of just doing little quick pumping movements at the bottom or at the top of the exercise, but they don't actually go through the full extent of the motion. Another one I see all the time is things like a leg press, where you watch the platform only move just like a few inches with each rep, when we should really be trying to bend our knees and our hips as far as we can before pushing back into extension, and even controlling ourselves into full extension without locking our knees out at the end. So basically, when performing most exercises, it's really important to go through the full range of motion if you're looking to get the most benefit out of the exercise, and also to train your tissues to actually properly control your joints and to even help prevent injury. So this is something that is really crucial for people like me who are hypermobile, meaning that our joints move too much, because it's just super important to strengthen in your entire range of motion that we have within that joint. And that goes for whether you're hypermobile or not. It's just that if you're hypermobile, you have even more mobility that you need to be working through. So you need to be working through that entire range, because we're actually everybody's more likely to get injured within that range of motion that you have not learned to control or develop proper strength in. These things are just easiest to notice and point out when it's those quick little pumping movements like we talked about, but it's also important to note that this happens more often when someone is going through like 75% of the range of the exercise and missing out on that last 25%, or even like 90 and 10%. So these things can be a bit harder to see for an untrained eye, but a good example of this is something like a squat or even a hip thrust, where someone doesn't come into that full hip extension, which is actually the point of the exercise that we get the best glute engagement. So essentially, you could be missing out on the most important or most beneficial part of the exercise that is doing what you are looking for it to do. So really controlling and going throughout that whole range is important. Alrighty. We'll move on from that. The next mistake I notice people making is starting with too much load and or not starting with enough load. And I think that the too much load part is pretty straightforward. It pretty much links up with the first 2 points that we already went over, because if you're moving too much load, we're likely going to see or feel some compensation, like the momentum-based lifting that we talked about, or you may not be able to go through the full range of motion. Maybe you can't control that whole motion, or it could even just simply be not being able to complete the number of reps and sets that you are looking to complete. So if you're doing any of these things or seeing any of these things, it likely means that you need to lower the weight that you're using, especially if you're like not able to keep your form right, things like that. Now, not loading enough is an issue that we typically see more with women, but I think we are finally starting to move away from this, which is good. For the longest time, women were scared to lift heavy because they were afraid of looking a certain way, but I'm so glad that we are starting to overcome this and embrace women being able to actually have some muscle bulk and definition. And I see more and more girls every day online that are actually focusing on moving load, which is good. But historically, that's not been the case. And this not moving enough load might look like never really experiencing any muscle fatigue. So you might feel like you could do more than 20 repetitions of any exercise without a rest period. It could be as simple as not feeling very challenged or not seeing the changes that you're wanting to see in your body. You don't have to just keep increasing the weights forever. Once you're happy with where you're at, looking the way that you want to look, you can do all the things that you want to do. Then you can just kind of have fun and focus on the maintenance phase. But if you're looking to make changes to your body, the weight also needs to change. And so for most of us women, it usually needs to go up. And this really just boils down to basic overload principle, which means if we aren't challenging ourselves or we aren't overloading ourselves, then we aren't changing or progressing. So we have to keep increasing the demands if we want our bodies to adapt or grow or be able to do or achieve something new. And so even if you don't care about growing your muscles or looking a certain way, or maybe you don't have a specific fitness goal in mind that you want your body to adapt to, this is still really important with just your normal daily life activities. Especially for like mamas out there who have little ones who just continue to grow every single year and they get heavier each year. If you are continuously putting load on your body that is more than what you are training with, then your body is not being trained to take on that load properly. And so to clarify a little further, when we refer to a load, we're really just talking about weight. This could be your body weight, which can also change based on your position against gravity and things like that. We could also be talking about external weight. So looking like carrying a laundry basket or picking up groceries or bending over to pick something up off the floor, carrying your kid to bed, anything like that. But even things like standing up off the couch or getting off of the floor, you have the load of gravity and your body weight. And this is where I could go down a major how fitness is tied to function rabbit hole. So I'm going to stop myself there and move on to our next point. But just know that your load needs to also match what you're trying to accomplish in your normal daily activities. All right, so the next thing that I notice all the time is people not bracing their core while they're lifting. This is like a whole hot topic right now about bracing, how to do it correctly, all the things. I'm not even going down that road today because we could probably do an entire series on how to brace your core properly. But for the sake of what I want you guys to understand for today, we're going to just keep it very simple, and I'm going to give you a few key points. And that is that 1, your belly should not just be relaxed while you're lifting weights, regardless of the exercise that you're doing. 2, we should be able to engage and stabilize through our core muscles at any time, but especially before or during a lift. 3, we should be able to keep our core engaged and be able to breathe at the same time, which is really challenging, by the way, for a lot of people. 4, we should not be holding our breath and or using a Valsalva maneuver in order to lift weights. And 5, we should have at least some awareness of our spine positioning, especially when we are lifting. So with this, typically what I see is people doing things like a squat or a deadlift with their back arched in what we call an excessive lordotic curve, which some amount of curve is normal, but there's a lot of women especially who hang out in that really excessive curve, which this position, by the way, just basically puts your lower core and your glutes at a major disadvantage, so it's just not helpful. So having some spinal awareness there is really important. I also see a lot of people relying on things like belts for lifting, which unless you are a very, very, very experienced heavy lifter and you've already learned how to brace your core and breathe properly without a belt, and you're using it more to just kind of facilitate or protect your low back, then you probably shouldn't be using it at all. And it is in fact probably making your core weaker because it is doing the job that your core should be able to do all on its own. So the takeaway there is that belts really should only be used for very specific people and very specific reasons. Less significant, but another example of not bracing the core that I see is simply people keeping a relaxed posture through their midsection with any typical exercises. So they're really missing out on the functional core strength they could be gaining from the same exact exercise by just focusing on first bracing their core. And that can be as simple as, again, something like a bicep curl, especially if you're doing it with both sides. You can get a little core work too if you first brace. And that also kind of ties us back to the first point I made about being able to lift in a slow and controlled fashion. If you're focusing on keeping your core engaged and your trunk stable as you perform any exercise, you're automatically going to slow the movement down, which is also going to help you avoid compensations like we already talked about, and just kind of help you get more bang for your buck out of your exercise that you're doing. All right, so the next thing I see often is people simply just starting way too aggressive with their workouts. This happens all the time. People honestly just don't think they're doing anything aggressive because it's either typical stuff that they see other people doing or they found online on their own, or it's just like a beginner level group exercise class, so they assume that it is a safe place to start. But most people don't realize that even something as simple as a squat or a lunge or burpees or push-ups or jumping, running, etc. can all be considered a very advanced exercise depending on your fitness level. And all of those things have kind of prerequisites in terms of mobility and strength and coordination combination requirements before you should be doing it. And it really all just depends on where you're starting from and what your goals are. So I like to tell most of my patients, slow and gradual progress is really important in terms of injury prevention and injury recovery, and like kind of trying to get back into whatever it is that you want to do. It's always about being slow and gradual so that your body has time to adapt. So if you've been sedentary and not exercising, even just trying to prioritize walking longer distances or getting more steps in can feel like a drastic change for your body. So this is especially if you're coming back from an injury or if you're dealing with any type of chronic pain. If you've never exercised before, or maybe even if you just haven't exercised in a long time, all these things matter on where you should start. Just unfortunately, people jump into a new exercise program all the time before their bodies are really ready. And that's a super common reason why people end up seeing me for PT. So I think that this is a unique place, before starting any exercise routine, for PTs to kind of come into the picture. And I do hope that that starts to become more of a normal at some point, as this is the reason that I developed an annual PT appointment, to be able to identify limitations that people have before they start having pain, ideally. Because after you've been assessed by a PT, you really have a good idea of where your limitations are and can help make sure your body is mobile and strong and balanced, and that you have all the proper mechanics or movement patterns that you need to have in order to do what you are looking to do. And then we can teach you how to properly and safely progress into a routine. And so, yeah, I hope that we kind of do a better job of that. And then another point that I see people making is doing only cardio or only resistance training. And people seriously have a love-hate relationship with cardio. You either love it or you hate it. I find people who are really focused on their strength training tend to avoid cardio altogether. They might even say that they just try to lift weights faster to get their heart rate up so that they don't have to do cardio. But let me tell you, nothing really replaces the benefit of actually training your cardiovascular system. And then there are people who are the complete opposite, and they love cardio. And these people tend to focus 100% of their effort on cardio, or they just simply don't prioritize enough strength training in their routines. And so in order to get all the benefits from exercise that we talked about last week, you really need a combination of cardio and resistance training. And if you don't know the benefits I'm talking about, tune in to last week's episode where we cover all those things. But this is really spoken by somebody who has gone through both phases of my relationship with cardio. I went through a phase where I could do 45 plus minutes of cardio every day and never get tired of it. And then I had no energy left after, and I never wanted to lift or do any strength training at all when I was done. And then I've also gone through phases where all I've done is lift weights, and even saving the last 5 to 10 minutes at the end of a workout for walking on the treadmill felt like pure torture. So I can really speak to both things. And let me tell you, over the last couple months, I have finally started to find a balance with making sure that I get both cardio and resistance training in. And I just feel like I'm getting so much more out of my routine. I actually feel a lot of those benefits that we talked about last week that I haven't always experienced with working out. And I tend to prefer to lift weights first because that's really what requires the most energy for me. And then walk on the treadmill after, whenever I can just zone out with a book or podcast or music for a while. And that doesn't really take as much physical energy for me. But that's generally the best order if you're trying to fit both things into one session, is to start with the one that requires the most energy or effort out of you. So if you tend to hate one of them, is probably best to start with that one, so you just get it out of the way, and that way you can't avoid it at the end of your workout when you are fatigued. So you can try my little method there. All right, and the last item for today, and I could talk about this one for days, so I'm going to try my best to keep it very brief, is only training into flexion or extension or forward, backward movements. Our bodies do not just move in flexion or extension, but this is how we train and what most typical gym exercises involve. So it's probably because most of our largest muscle groups in the body are primarily responsible for either flexion or extension, but our bodies bend in all directions. They move side to side, they rotate, they do any combination of these motions. So why don't we train those motions? And this is a trend I kind of see changing a little bit online, and I hope it's kind of catching some traction with, people that aren't just PTs. But it's probably the biggest difference that I see between exercises that we work on in PT and the things that you see people doing in their typical training. And so for this reason, I don't find it surprising at all that most people, regardless of their fitness level, when they come to see me in therapy, almost always test stronger into their muscles for flexion and extension than they do into the muscle groups that are responsible for rotation or any side-to-side movements or anything like that. So, just a fun little tidbit there. And if you don't know where to start, you always know who you can call. So as always with Improve with Dr. Lindsay, we hope to provoke thought, expand understanding and awareness, inspire and motivate, and most of all, improve your life. See you back next week, guys. Thanks for tuning in.